you're away.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, look, thanks very much, Ben. So yeah, I'm excited for this session. I'll talk for about 30 minutes or just less than 30 minutes, hopefully. And today we're going to focus on the unthinkable and how to bear the unbearable. And in July 1985, the unthinkable happened in Auckland when a terrorist attack on the Rainbow Warrior sank that ship, resulting in a fatality. And the French government paid reparations to New Zealand as a result. And the reparations funding was used to fund New Zealand's nuclear impact study, which contemplated the effect that a Northern Hemisphere nuclear war might have on New Zealand as a remote island nation. And basically that study found that even if New Zealand was not directly targeted and didn't suffer the effects of explosions and radiation, that there are 4 critical factors that meant that there would probably be significant consequences for New Zealand. And these 4 themes emerging from this study were New Zealand's immense dependency on trade, the increasing vulnerability of complex systems, the interdependence between sectors, such that if one suffers some consequences, potentially all do, and also the lack of planning for these sorts of scenarios. And then nothing happened for 35 years. And through 2023, we have focused again on the risk of nuclear war, but in a new context, a context where there is cloud technology, undersea fiber optic cables, monocropping agriculture, and New Zealand is 100% dependent on imported fuels. So our work is about nuclear war, but it's about so much more than that. And this is because nuclear war is only one of a suite of potential global catastrophes that could befall the world. Nuclear war could lead to a context with consequences for climate, fuel supply, industrial inputs, agricultural yield, energy production, all these sorts of systems. But other global catastrophes, these big hazards that might originate elsewhere but spread around the entire world with severe consequences for every country, include things like a supervolcanic eruption, ecological overshoot, solar flare, global cyber attack, all sorts of things. And as you'll see, that many of these in the table, many of these catastrophes share common potential consequences. And so the mantra that I want you to start thinking of is solve for nuclear war, solve for all. It's not quite that simple, but that's a good starting point. So what have we actually done over the last year? Well, we have aimed to take steps that you might ordinarily see in a publicly facing national risk assessment and publicly facing national risk register. And we began by developing a hazard profile for the hazard of Northern Hemisphere nuclear war. We then validated that hazard profile, at a multidisciplinary workshop in February of this year. We have conducted a qualitative survey of stakeholders and experts, as well as an in-depth interview study of expert knowledge holders. We've conducted desk research and surveyed the international literature. We've produced technical papers and academic papers, and we're in the process of finalizing a main report, which will be out next month. Now, no one can be expert across all the relevant sectors that we've been looking into, and we certainly don't claim to be, hence the stakeholder engagement, hence events such as this webinar, which is part of the process. The panel discussion that will follow this presentation will hopefully provide some information that will feed into our main report. Perhaps we'll modify a few things as a result. So today is certainly not the final word on nuclear war and New Zealand's resilience. And in fact, we hope that it's the first word. So our first step was to devise this hazard profile, a hazard profile which contemplates the likelihood and consequences of a Northern Hemisphere nuclear war and the impact that might have on New Zealand, or the global context that might result, and the impact that might have on New Zealand. We surveyed 3 different scenarios, and our midline scenario is one where 250 to 500 weapons are detonated, mostly targeting military command and control targets, but including capital cities. And it appears that the major effects on New Zealand would stem from 3 processes. 1, the physical destruction of Northern Hemisphere infrastructure, including ports, airports, pipelines, cities, bridges, energy systems. The effects of any electromagnetic pulses that might disable electrical systems or electrical grids across large regions of the world. and also the potential impacts of a nuclear winter, where soot rises into the stratosphere, blocks the sun, and cools the Earth. So although areas of the Northern Hemisphere may look like the picture on the left, the day after a nuclear war, which is a photograph of Hiroshima from the atomic detonation there, the day after a nuclear war, New Zealand may appear relatively unscathed. However, severe impacts will be on their way as fuel inputs perhaps end, energy generation reduces, digital systems and communication systems may be severely damaged. It may be impossible to get spare parts. Changing climate may impact agricultural yields. There could be global fragmentation, social and economic mayhem. And the next figure illustrates this schematically. What we see is a global context that appears to be deteriorating in geopolitical strategic terms at the moment, with almost every trend line going in the wrong direction. A context that potentially gives birth to a global catastrophe, such as nuclear war, where we see physical destruction and a nuclear winter impacting the climate, leading to severe trade isolation for New Zealand. In a context where there is destruction of supply chains, not merely disruption, where sectors within New Zealand, digital, become disconnected, transport, we lose fuel, energy shortages, agricultural failures due to lack of industrial inputs, economic disruption, and these features all interact with each other in a cycle of potentially cascading harm. It may be a context where no one is coming to help, not internationally, and perhaps not even interregionally, if communications and transport become degraded over weeks and months following the war. And there's a paradox here, because a non-combatant island nation like New Zealand, far from the fighting, may escape the bombs and the attacks, but it's also potentially the most vulnerable because of its isolation, because of the impacts the loss of trade may bring. So, having created our hazard profile, we workshopped the scenarios. We had 20 multidisciplinary experts from the public sector, private sector, and academia. And what we did is we had them each independently rate the impact of the scenario according to 12 damage indicators across 4 impact areas: the effect on individuals, the environment, the economy, and society. When the individual participants rated the damage on their own, and we monetized that damage, estimated it, the impact on New Zealand in monetary terms would be hundreds of billions of dollars. But after the workshop, when the experts had had a chance to discuss with each other, talk through the cascading consequences across sectors, and then re-rate the impacts, the mean impact was in excess of $1 trillion in monetized harm for New Zealand. Immense consequences. And yet the participants rated the scenario as quite plausible when considering the intent and capability of the potential perpetrators and the technical and operational feasibility of nuclear war. So we then took one scenario from the workshop and used that to frame a survey and interview study. And in total, across the workshop, a qualitative survey, and in-depth interviews lasting up to 2 hours each, we engaged with about 80 different stakeholders and experts. And you see in the table here some of the sorts of people that we had engaged with. All these people here were interviewed. So you have chief information officers, chief executives, consultants, senior academics, former senior public servants. So these are people with immense knowledge, and we heard a lot. So what did we find? Well, we have published on the website, the project website, separately, a summary of the survey findings and the interview findings. And just pulling up one figure that's found in the survey report, what this shows is that the people we talked to were able to articulate what they thought that the impacts within New Zealand might be of this sort of scenario, and to list potential response options that might mitigate those impacts, and as well potential preparation options that might reduce the amount of harm that is suffered. And what I'm going to focus on next in the next few minutes of this talk is not every sector, but just what we call the big four critical sectors that might be severely impacted, and there's potentially something that could be done about that. The main report that's coming out at the end of next month covers a lot more than just these 4 sectors. It also includes things like border issues, things like social response, the economy, that sort of thing. But let's just look at these 4 sectors to begin with. So beginning with potentially the most critical, agriculture and food. The main impacts of a Northern Hemisphere nuclear war on New Zealand's agricultural system would be through two mechanisms. One is a loss of industrial inputs. It might be extremely difficult to get things like fertilizer, fuel, seed, agrochemicals. Another potential source of impact would be any nuclear winter that occurs, and reduction in sunlight and temperature could impact agricultural yields. Now, international modelling of these processes suggests that under the very worst case scenario, agricultural yield in New Zealand could drop 60% just due to nuclear winter. Under the very worst case scenarios, where all inputs and mechanisation are no longer possible because of fuel shortages and so forth, there could be another 40 or 50% reduction in agricultural yield. So suddenly, there's not much left. And we wrote some technical papers surveying some of these issues, looking at how many food calories are produced for export and whether that could be redirected to the domestic market, how to optimize cropping in a situation of an extended frost period, and crops like wheat and carrots might be more optimal than what's presently grown in some areas. And we were told in the engagements that we undertook that really, given all this potential, there should be a working group to develop a food security strategy, which would enable these issues to be properly considered, investigated, and planned for. We were also told that we might have to pivot agriculture in such a global context so that we focus on harvesting required produce and on the most productive land, and marginal land might best be left for fallow. So what we've done with each sector, each of these core sectors, is we've produced, I'm not expecting you to read this sheet, it's just to see what it looks like. For each sector, we've produced a one-page summary in the main report, which is structured so that it has an overview banner, and then it has boxes that detail potential, what we're calling resilience options. We're not saying these are recommendations. They should be further analysed, discussed, cost-benefit determined, and taken for consultation. But across things like sector and institutional reforms, government actions, local government actions, research and development, response plans, and we list co-benefits that might result from some of these options. And another category was investments in infrastructure. So if we just zoom in on that top banner for agriculture, the key desired outcome is actually being able to supply nutritious food to the population, no matter what the context. The main risks are the breakdown in trade and inputs and potential nuclear winter. And one of the main resilience options would be to start by developing a national food security strategy that, amongst other things, could include global catastrophic risks. Moving on to the next sector, energy. Northern Hemisphere nuclear war could see the end of fuel imports to New Zealand. It could see reduction in the generation of electricity due to reduced sunlight or changes in wind and precipitation patterns. There could be failures that are unable to be repaired because parts can't be come and expertise can't come from overseas. Now, some government risk assessment has looked at some of these things. MB commissioned reports into fuel supply disruptions, contemplating perhaps a 10% disruption to global fuel supply. They did not contemplate global catastrophes of the nature that we're discussing here. And in fact, commercial entities engaged in that research refused to speculate on the impact of such events. Yet this is despite war being the most prominent theme throughout human history, and that the trends of fuel security in New Zealand are all moving away from resilience, with the closure of the Marsden Point refinery, Z Energy closing its tallow biodiesel plant, biodiesel producers switching from making fuel to making food oil because it's more profitable, and the biofuel blend mandate dropped earlier this year. We were told that if we don't have diesel, it's pretty simple, the alternative. There's no way to get back to horse. The machinery simply doesn't exist anymore to do it that way. And we've written a technical paper about the relationship between fuel and agriculture, and I'll talk more about that later in this talk. Again, there's a summary sheet for energy and a lot more details in the main report, but just zooming right into one aspect of that, the need for a response plan. We were told that a fuel response plan really needs to have coordinated decision-making with principles of allocation based on quantities, unlike the current National Fuel Plan, and on sector interdependencies, and perhaps needs to prioritize things that might start to degrade over weeks and months, such as agricultural production or fuel for trade with Australia. And perhaps we need to look at the logistics of scaling local fuel supply, like biofuels. Transport. We could see a collapse in global shipping. Lack of fuel could lead to a halt in road trucking, which carries 93% of New Zealand's goods around the country. In the best of times, we have breakdowns in inter-island ferry services. Imagine if that happens and it's impossible to get spare parts from overseas or expertise to repair them. Logistics is heavily dependent on the internet and data. And if there's problems with fiber optic cables, satellites, and cloud server facilities, then this could impact logistics. Trade will be critical, but it's not clear that trade with even Australia is possible at scale without global shipping lines. How many ships are needed? Can they run on biodiesel? Can they be retrofitted with wind power? Do we have the right port infrastructure? Participants told us that they don't think that the transport sector in New Zealand is at all well equipped to organise itself in the absence of internet or usual government processes. Again, we've summarised these issues in a one-pager, and we detail them further in the main report. But zooming in on potential investments in infrastructure that were recommended to us throughout this project, it's apparent that we need more diversity in New Zealand's transport sector, that maybe there needs to be stockpiles of critical maintenance parts, increased electrification, interregional and urban rail, more biodiesel production for locomotives and ships, make sure trade with Australia is robust and resilient, and have a redundancy in the inter-island transport facilities. Moving into the final of the big four sectors, digital and ICT, there could be the loss of undersea cables, electromagnetic pulse destroying satellites. There could be bombing of data centers. There could be this could result in severe logistics breakdowns where it depends on cloud computing or the internet. Communication may be impossible. Digital transactions may be impossible. We heard that New Zealand is heavily dependent on a limited number of overseas service providers, and that New Zealand lacks local expertise to engineer solutions after the fact. We were told that there's simply not enough people that understand what they're using. And a lot of organizations don't have expertise in-house to respond or adapt. There may be a need for a national digital communications continuity plan, which provides onshore fallback for core communications. We have a summary sheet, and zooming in on potential sector or institutional reforms, we were told that maybe cloud infrastructure needs to be seen as critical national infrastructure. Perhaps we need to appoint a chief technology advisor or technology investment agency to ensure that the right facilities are available in New Zealand when they're needed. Maybe we need to change procurement rules to encourage local solutions and diversify provision of digital services locally. So now I just want to outline one possible solution to one possible problem in one of those sectors. And this is the problem of producing food in the absence of imported fuel. At present, food production in New Zealand consumes nearly 300 million litres of diesel per annum. But we've done calculations that show that you could produce enough food to feed the entire New Zealand population for just 5 to 14 million litres. And that 5 to 14 million litres could be provided by producing biodiesel locally. So how would that look? Well, this square represents the land area used for dairy production in New Zealand under business as usual conditions, approximately 1.7 million hectares. This is the land area used for wheat, and this is the land area used for potatoes, just as 3 example crops. This is the land area of dairy needed to feed only the New Zealand population without exporting any. If you were only growing wheat, you would only need this much land area to produce just enough calories, not suggesting everyone's only eating wheat, but just for demonstrative purposes. And if you're only growing potatoes, you'd only need this much land area. Now, if you were producing dairy to feed New Zealand, you would need to grow 32,000 hectares of canola, if you were using canola as a biofuel feedstock, to produce enough biodiesel to run the equipment to produce that dairy. If you were doing potatoes, it's this much. If you're doing wheat, it's this much. So this sort of analysis can help identify what sorts of crops we might want to pivot to, and therefore what sort of preparations ahead of time might be made to allow that pivot to occur after the fact. And at present, canola is produced on about 1,000 hectares of land. So you'd still have to ramp it up 4 times, but that's probably a lot easier than trying to ramp it up 32 times. And it's probably a lot easier to ensure that biodiesel production facilities that have the capacity. So this is just one simple example, but these kinds of approaches will be possible across other sectors for other problems, and there will be additional possible solutions for this problem as well. We're just saying that it's one example, putting it out there for discussion. We also focused on risk management itself, as well as core sectors. And we were told that in New Zealand, much of the risk management work is focused on how to react to disaster. But there's two weaknesses here, because those processes don't contemplate reacting to the scale of a global catastrophic event. And given that scale, even a reactive approach is not going to be as effective as usual. And we agree, and we've written a technical paper on the need for anticipatory governance of catastrophic risks, and how anticipatory governance needs to use appropriate methods in our paper on national risk assessments and the need for stakeholder engagement. These methods need to appropriately calculate the true cost benefit, including expected harm from major global catastrophes and the co-benefits of resilience measures for other risks and for business as usual. And the analysis needs to be grounded in values around concepts of future generations and discount rates and things like this. And we may need a think tank or a national science mission to achieve this sort of analysis and prioritize the best resilience options. Again, there's a summary about risk management, and zooming in on potential actions central government could take in this case, we advocate in the report and in our technical papers for a systematic, all hazards, publicly facing national risk assessment and risk register that addresses not just the expected consequences of disaster, but maps that to potential resilience options so that we can collaborate and crowdsource and discuss how to approach these risks with good risk information. So it may be that a few leaks in the national risk management system need to be plugged. And what do I mean by some leaks? Well, the Productivity Commission earlier this year put out for consultation a request for submissions on improving economic resilience. The implication being that the economy is not as resilient as it could be. We submitted on this consultation, and we recommended that the Productivity Commission model a zero trade scenario to try and understand the ramifications of this sort of disaster. And to their credit, they have commissioned Motu to model a large representative trade shock, the results of which will be out early November, I believe. DPMC has put out for consultation, or I think it's closed now, consultation on critical infrastructure resilience regulation. Again, the implication being that critical infrastructure isn't as resilient as perhaps it could be or ought to be. And our submission on that basically argued that it's all very well and good making the critical infrastructure upon which we currently depend more resilient by making it stronger or more robust. But it may be that we also need to think about identifying and investing in infrastructure that we might need if we have to pivot to a new way of doing things in a dramatically changed global context. And therefore, we need to invest in resilience infrastructure as well as building resilient infrastructure. So how might this look centrally? What we have, very schematically, is a bunch of organizations in New Zealand that manage risk. NEMA has a focus on natural hazards. DPMC has a nationally significant risks list on their website. There's a national security group that largely focuses on malicious threats to New Zealand. And there's quite coherent and good management of what you might call ordinary risks. From everything that I've just been saying, though, it seems like perhaps we also need a systematic, publicly facing national risk assessment that specifically includes global catastrophes, so that that can inform a set of strategies for food security, energy security, transport security, and so on in a changed global context, which might also inform the critical infrastructure program to ensure we have both those resilience infrastructure development and ensure current critical infrastructure is resilient, so that we can provide basic needs as a country in a global catastrophe context. But how to link these two things? Well, in our anticipatory governance paper, we suggested something like a parliamentary commissioner for extreme risks and/or a chief risk officer, which could analyze what's going on across risks find where the gaps are, find risks like potentially Northern Hemisphere nuclear war, which aren't fully addressed yet, and they could be responsible for producing the publicly facing systematic national risk assessment. They could also advise Parliament, perhaps a bipartisan committee with a shared interest in mitigating national risks, who could instruct the Chief Risk Officer. Parliament could be supported by legislation, a Risk Assessment and Response Act, perhaps, with a focus on global catastrophes. And the United States has recently enacted exactly that sort of act. And of course, there needs to be international coordination. These are cross-border risks. New Zealand needs to cooperate with Australia, ensure that trade can continue, and things like this. So, just to wrap up, here's 3 final resilience options that we think are potentially quite important. One is to undertake that risk assessment that specifically includes global catastrophic risks. If you include nuclear war and you address it, solving for nuclear solves for all the others to some degree. We need that resilience infrastructure and resilience building, not just making things that exist already more robust. And one concrete example I've given is to update the National Fuel Plan so that it quantifies volumes and contemplates how to supply that fuel over an extended period of time after the onshore fuel reserves are exhausted, perhaps by converting biofuel feedstock into renewable diesel to grow food. And dependence will remain if we lose our connections to the world or if regions lose connections to each other. And we need to anticipate that and overcome that. And perhaps we could initiate a government-supported, long-term, nationwide narrative of cooperation and a program of community resilience building with global catastrophe and trade isolation the explicit target. And if we do some of these things, our research has suggested that there will likely be co-benefits. There might be reduced dependence on overseas entities. There might be reduced greenhouse gas emissions, improved population health, development of industries, increased security in a range of different ways, and a host of other benefits. And these need to be factored in when analysing the cost effectiveness of various options. So we need to consider destruction, not just disruption of global supply chains. But we are just a small team supported by philanthropic donations and volunteers. We can't do everything ourselves. We hope that organizations, industries, governments, community groups read the report that we're putting out next month and consider how it might apply to them. What do these scenarios mean for them? Run scenarios, red team resilience measures, see where the weaknesses are, collaborate on plans. And not just for the sake of New Zealand, but because New Zealand could sustain itself to some degree through this sort of catastrophe, that could help prevent civilization collapse globally and the risk of human extinction. And I'll leave you with that thought.
Well, ka pai, Matt. Pretty compelling. Yeah, plenty of food for thought and also discussion. If I could bring all of the panelists back. Yeah, great work. What I'll do now, I think Sam and I will work kind of as co-facilitators. We'll go through just asking each panelist a question. Before you start answering the initial question, feel free to pipe up if you have any kind of prior reflections on the study or its pros, benefits, that sort of thing. And yeah, we'll go from here. So just as a first question, I thought I'd bounce off Lucy, given that she has sort of experience in the COVID response area, and kind of ask, because you've had that experience during, the disruptions caused by COVID-19, Lucy, in what way do you sort of see nuclear war or other global catastrophes as being similar to that or different? And, what investments might be needed? What provisions at government level, local level, that sort of thing?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Look, it was a really great presentation. Yeah, from a COVID perspective, when I was managing the COVID recovery and supply chain team at MPI, so what we really noticed really quickly was how vulnerable our supply chains are. That wasn't noticed sort of before COVID. COVID was kind of the catalyst to that. They were already quite sensitive, to change, but then COVID really hit their supply chains. That wasn't just from an export perspective, it was from an import side as well. So that meant that there was, and you've alluded to it in the work that you've been doing, there was a lot of challenges with getting products into New Zealand and out, but it also had a big impact on our systems domestically, like the Inter-Islander and, the systems that we manage here in transport. We've lost a lot of our resilience with the closure of Marsden Point from last year. So we've slowly been getting away from those resilience things that we had through to, now having the electric side. So you've talked about that as well. And in the electrification, I think that's actually a really good way of looking at it. And we're doing that in some cases already. So there is an orchard, like a cherry orchard down in Southland that's fully electric, right? So there's places that are using this strategy already. And you've also mentioned the food security strategy. I think that's critical. So we don't have it here in New Zealand. They have food security strategies in most countries I've been to, even through the Nuffield program. And there are groups working on this, like the Aotearoa Circle, the Manakai framework. But food security in New Zealand, right now, 1 in 5 households is food insecure at some point in the week. That's even without global catastrophes. So what happens when we do have a global catastrophe? With that food strategy as well, when you're looking at that 1 in 5, it gets even higher, those proportions, when you're looking at Māori and Pacifica households. So really important to get that food strategy right. And you did talk about biofuels, and I'd probably be a bit more cautious around biofuels. Yeah, because with, if say there's this global catastrophe, we're not going to get the imports we're used to, like your ag chems and fertilizers, which you use to grow canola and other, like corn, whatever you're using as your biofuel source. And what happened in the US when they made biofuel a requirement as part of their gas profile, then now a quarter of the world's corn is grown in the US, but then 40% of that doesn't even see the food system. It goes straight into fuel. So I don't know if that is actually the best use of land. So I'd be very cautious around the biofuel use. And yeah, just in the supply chains, there's another piece of work that's also being worked on, because the one thing the government and here in New Zealand that we haven't been so good at traditionally, that is changing now, is that long-term infrastructure view. So even the Ministry of Transport has just released in August their New Zealand Freight and Supply Chain Strategy. So that also helps support this work.
Does anybody else want to comment on this? Matt or Hamish?
Yeah, sure. If no one else is, just on the biofuel thing, probably the most important thing is to figure out a plan to scale up after the fact, so that suddenly fuel is much more valuable than food if it means you can grow food. And so maybe having a minimal refining capability set up ahead of time, and the logistics in place so that that canola or whatever could be scaled up after the fact might be one approach.
And I just want to say as well on that, Lucy, I don't think that the biofuel one is not necessarily claiming that's the best thing to do. It's a thing to do, isn't it, Matt? We need to explore many other options, and we need to have probably, in the reality, we probably have to end up with many different things in our artillery in order to be resilient.
And I agree,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Sorry, no, you go, Hamish.
No, where you go?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So we need to be quite diversified, and Singapore's done that really well, right? So Singapore has trade agreements with 156 different countries. So they're looking really in that diversified strategy. So again, we can use that in our areas as well, whether that's fuel or who we're working with. But yeah, just that diversification. So I agree with that.
So first, I think I'd commend everyone on a fantastic report with some really amazing insights. And I think one of the I think energy is one of these things which we've got to go and think about, right? We're closing things down because we're worrying about climate change and all those things, but we actually need it for resilience. And we've become less resilient over the last, I've been away from New Zealand for 20-something years before, but you look at how less resilient we are today than what we were back in the 80s. And there's this really interesting question about New Zealand. We've become more globally integrated and less resilient as a result of it. And we actually haven't got the infrastructure and we haven't got the mechanisms to be able to engage. And we've given that up to other people, right? So we've become these massive traders, which has been great under rules-based trade. However, if we can't have access to key pieces, suddenly our whole system collapses. And remember, we're a very urbanized country, right? We're one of the most urbanized countries in the world. And food security is not just about having access to food, it's actually having income to be able to support it. And our economy is based off trade. We don't have a domestic economy that can support ourselves. And so in that export economy is based off food and tourism, both of which would suffer substantially if we had a catastrophic risk, which means we've got this sort of multiplication on the impact of food security, because food security is an income problem. If you can't afford to buy it and you're in an urban area, you starve, right? And so how do we actually get it? So it's not just that we can produce stuff, it's actually people can't afford to go and buy it because our whole economy collapses because we're so integrated into the world economy. Like if you're the US, the world economy, yes, it has an impact, but there's a large domestic economy. In New Zealand, we have no effective domestic economy of scale or size, and we've got to trade. So we've got to move people by planes. We've got to move products by ships, whether it's import or export, and all of that falls over. And so I don't think that we really understand what this full risk is. Bovis and then COVID have helped us start thinking about some of this at a smaller scale, but whoa, we've got to get so much better and really understanding what these impacts. And it's not just the whole catastrophic one. What would happen if we just lost China? What would happen if we couldn't go and trade with Northern Asia? If you just took Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China out of the marketplace, what would that impact be on New Zealand?
What do you suggest would be the priorities for, building resilience in these areas, Hamish? What would you're saying that we've kind of moved on from the 80s, and it's sort of a bit of a paradox in terms of we need progress, but progress is also depleting our resilience potentially.
So I think what you've raised, this report's raised my eyes to it. I don't think we include resilience in a global catastrophe space into our decision making about whether we open or close infrastructure. So that Marsden Point, right? If you thought about it from a resilient space, you wouldn't have closed it, right? You would have kept the oil fields in Taranaki going because that gives us resilience to these types of events. Now, all of the events we're facing at the moment, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, or whether it's the potential issues with China and Taiwan, they're all plausible. But we've closed things down around the edges, which have made us less resilient because it hasn't been part of that decision-making function that we've had as part of the decision processes. And so it's actually making it so it is part of the decision processes, and they have to address this and understand what that catastrophic risk is. If you're banking someone, you think about catastrophic risks. Does someone have insurance for this? Does someone have, what happens if this top person within this organization dies? What's the impact of it? But do we actually think about that from a New Zealand level? I think it's a really interesting challenge.
I just noticed that Ben's got his hand up.
Yeah, well, just following up from Hamish's comments there. So this really feels that, I mean, first of all, Matt and Ben and Sam and the team, just amazing work. I think you've just, uncovered such a lot of wealth of scenarios and potential approaches to it. So just great that you've been there to do the work, because it wouldn't have got done otherwise. I think, so I spent quite a lot of time in the sort of foresight futurist space, with a tech bent in particular. But you look at, Singapore in particular and some other countries, and they have, what the Centre for Strategic Futures, which is like sort of really core part of how their government functions, which really does foresight at a level of sophistication. And so, to Hamish's point, there is continually exercising scenarios, sort of hypothesizing scenarios, working out what if, and how you respond. And we instead have a sort of 3-year political cycle that is very much focused on, who's going to pay, 2 points of a percent less tax, this 3 years round. Short-term domestic issues. There wasn't a single conversation about foreign policy in the recent election as well, or anything that goes on outside our borders, to be quite honest. And we are the mower with their head stuck in the sand in many ways. We just almost don't want to know. It feels from a national point of view. And so I think just the establishment of a long-term foresight capability, or capabilities, if it needs to be federated, if it's not going to be centralized, is just what's missing here. Is that you're doing it. You're one of the few small think tanks that are out there doing it. And when you compare that to other countries, with similarly strategic precariousness, then we underinvest there.
I'd agree. I think one of the really interesting things is, and I was shocked, like our industry, lots of our industry bodies just have a domestic mandate to worry about their farmers. They don't have an international mandate to think about what's going to happen to markets. You go and look at them, they just don't have enough. We don't have enough agricultural economists and people going looking, and we give that all over to industry and the multinationals and the private processors to go and understand what's going to happen. And they may be doing some of this work internally, but we haven't got those bodies which are actually going and doing this analysis to understand what's going on in the international markets, and then communicating it back to the average farmer or the average individual stakeholder in New Zealand to actually understand this. And so it sort of falls on government to try and do some of this, but the rest of us forget about it. None of our industry bodies are thinking about it and really engaging. Aotearoa Circle's starting to, and some of the agricultural leaders are starting to do within that one. But from an industry body standpoint, if you went to Dairy NZ or you went to a beef and lamb, etc., it might be on their radar screen, but at the level we're talking about here, I don't even think it's COVID. And then Bovis have started to raise the implications of it and thinking about it. But before those, it wasn't, I don't even think it was on our radar screen about what was potentially the problem. And so how do we get that? Do we need a centre? What's it look like? How do we engage it? How do we lift this conversation?
This aim is, I think, if I may, Adam Childs here from Hawke's Bay, he has actually asked the same question here for, this political 3-year political thing that is so hard to, how can we actually do any of these long-term things when we always have political parties changing every 3 years? And I think that goes into environmental fighting and resilience and everything. And I think that's a big discussion.
It's a constitutional question.
Yes, yeah. And I think we should move on from that. But it is a really, really interesting topic. I would love to hear a little bit from Charlotte and Mark. Charlotte, what do you think? What did you have a question for her as well, Ben? Ben Payne?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a question. I guess, Charlotte, you've spent a lot of time thinking around community resilience and how local governments and community organizations can be supported in their resilience journey in the face of global catastrophic risks. And, is there applicability around the work you're currently doing with how that might kind of influence how as a nation we respond to a catastrophic event?
Yeah, I think in my response, I might kind of link the previous conversation with that question, and sort of, I guess a nice reflection for this project might be, why did that report that was written 35 years ago, why did nothing happen? And what are we going to do differently to make it happen? And we've sort of talked about those sort of top down and the constitutional issues that are affecting our ability to respond to these. But I also think there's a kind of a on the ground reality that many communities are really struggling day to day. And to even conceptualize some of these catastrophic risks is just impossible. It's about getting food on the table, getting their kids to school. And I think some of Cyclone Gabrielle recovery, and you've probably seen a bit of this in Northland, Mark, and I think we've talked about it a bit as well, is that, talking about resilience to natural hazards, which people have just experienced, is even really difficult because it's just about getting through day to day. So, and I think that's a reality we really need to remember. And I was really pleased to see in the slides, Mark, you highlighting those co-benefits of saying, well, if we start to do these things, then there'll be other things that will help us day to day. And I think perhaps in a way we need to develop resilience by stealth, and we need to focus on those co-benefits. Work on things like having a healthy population, an equitable population, education, good social capital, both, that bonding and bridging, for those who are familiar with those terms, so within the community, but also within being able to talk with political leaders and institutions and things, and good environmental health and things. So I think we need to do both. I'm not saying we should only do, the bottom up and the base sort of performance things, but I think that is really important, to recognize the limitations and the stresses that people are under.
What would be your kind of, I guess, key priority or intervention in that regard? Is it about, it's a really challenging thing, I guess, for governments to have integration across such a huge scale, but are there priority areas? Or
like it's not a simple thing, but I think some of the comments that I've been making before is around how we approach our decision making, and sort of valuing that resilience and that adaptability, I think, is really important. And some people have, I think, Matt, you made a few comments in your presentation around decision making processes, Treasury Better business case, and our cost benefit analysis. Some of the underlying processes within those decision making frameworks aren't great for evaluating resilience and recognizing how it could benefit us. So I think there's some changes that need to be made in those sorts of processes to really highlight how we value resilience.
Just to touch on that, do you think that government and also public stakeholders need more risk information? I feel like in some of the work I've done previously in geohazards and the likes, there's almost a saturation point with how much information communities can take on. Are we not having these conversations because there's sort of no systematic understanding of what the risks are?
I think it comes back to my point about people's willingness to hear what they're being told, and the moa in the sand is how it is, because people are just trying to survive, and actually I'm trying to get through the next 2 years, particularly business cycles are really small. Getting to Maori communities, and they're looking at longer time frames, so it's different across different entities and individuals and communities. But the thing that I'd probably talk to when thinking about risk information is really the language that's used when we're talking about these risks. Traditionally, risk management is quite a protectionist kind of language. There's a threat and we're going to control, avoid, eliminate it. But actually, these really complex risks, things like climate change, things like nuclear war, all these global threats that are on the horizon, but we don't know exactly when they're going to occur or what they're going to look like. We need to kind of change that language, and it's much more around being sort of change ready, being ready to adapt, to live with, to accommodate, thinking sort of more symbiotic language, I think. Yeah, so those are some forming thoughts that I've had over the last couple of months. Yeah,
that's really, really brilliant kind of insights. I guess if we could sort of pass over to Mark, Mark is an expert in disaster response and recovery. What would be your take on what Charlotte sort of said?
I think I've got 3 quick caveats, folks. One is I'm not an expert. When Matt invited me to an expert panel, I said, I think you've got the wrong guy. Second would be, I've been up since 3 a.m, folks. So if I don't quite finish a sentence, then that explains it. And there you go. I forgot what the third caveat was. I'm trying to think 7 things at once. It doesn't always work, does it? I might draw together a couple of other quick themes, though. One is around, so Lucy and Ben mentioned long term. So I remember my third caveat. Sorry, here I am. Which is, despite the fact I'm wearing the jacket, I'm not really speaking on behalf of civil defence tonight, folks. I was just rushed over from something at National Crisis Management Centre and then into a meeting and onto this. Long term. So for recovery, we've got a director's guideline within Aotearoa New Zealand for recovery within civil defence architecture. And it states that we should consider a certain time frame when we do recovery planning. And I've approached a lot of people in the last 8 months to say, did you know about this? And most people don't, including a lot of people who are recovery managers. And so I've asked business people, folks in civil defence, government, governance at high levels to say, what's your guess then? Are we meant to factor in days, months, years? How many of those would it be? And so for everyone here, I invite you to have a quick guess at that as well, given this is a director's guideline for what I'm meant to abide by. Now you've got your number in your head. The answer is 100 years. And I was quite surprised to read that, and then went around and asked the same kind of folk to say, well, what do you think about that? And to be fair, almost everybody laughed at the notion, including people in the sector, whether this was folks who were in business, whether this was people who were elected members, whether this was people who are in civil defence. The folks who didn't were in climate change. And so I believe there's a national climate change document that talks about 100 years. But it makes me wonder, like, what does it take to have a modern culture, a polyculture? Obviously, traditional cultures do this really well, that can actually think 100 years out. When you start to try and do it in concrete ways, it's actually quite hard. So in a personal capacity, I'm involved in a not-for-profit project. It's got a 400-year plan, but only because I feel like I can't think beyond 400 years. Getting beyond 100 was tough enough. So just reflecting on the idea of 100 years. And to tie that to the very last comment that Matt made about that if we got this right, then we could perhaps prevent the collapse of civilization globally. Let's not lose that, and let's not see it as the throwaway line. If anyone wants to see a historical parallel, there's a fantastic book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And there's some real parallels there between Matt's work of a few years ago about New Zealand as an island nation and how we could close borders in the context of a pandemic, if only we'd listened earlier, or the case of Aotearoa. So I think we do have historical precedent for this kind of thinking. I do think we've got historical examples. But I think it's interesting that it's taken a while to get really solid conversations about catastrophic research. When we then start pushing into, Ben's field of futurism, or when we push into collapsology studies, then it's almost like we're another step removed again. And that's, yet harder conversations to have, but they're so related to this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, Mark, we found that a little bit when we were talking to people, even some big thinkers out there, that they simply did not have the mental willingness or capacity to want to discuss this kind of catastrophe. It was just, it was beyond the reach or beyond the willingness to actually consider what would happen or how they would deal with it in their, in whatever the roles they had. There were few of those, so it is a hard discussion to have. Even just on a family level, it's hard to sit down and say, what are we going to have if this or that happens, right? So it's always a difficult discussion.
Yeah, and to tie that back to what Charlotte said, about things that last. We know how to build houses that last 500 years because we've still got some around. But we build houses to last 50 years. We can build certain kinds of infrastructure to last quite lengthy periods, but we say for various reasons that's not possible. A lot of the focus on building for future, though, is focused on infrastructure, and we see that replicated in civil defence contexts as well. One thing I've become profoundly interested in that touches on the edge of all this kind of work is around how cultures pass on messages across time. There's been some really fascinating research, whether it's the Clock of the Long Now project. There was a book, Deep Time, by Gregory Benford. There's been a lot of work around memory studies, and a recent-ish book, I think it was called Scatter, Adapt and Remember. So looking at the softer side of things, like the cultural practices of how communities pass down and across ages knowledge, including knowledge of how they got it wrong in the past, whether that was overshoot, whether that was resource depletion, and so on. And when we start talking about practices of memory, cultural memory, oral histories and tradition, how language changes over time, the premise of the clock along now was to say, if we've got nuclear waste that has a half-life of however long it is, how do we actually know when that amount of time is up? And so they put out, there's a thought project to a bunch of engineers, mathematicians, philosophers. And what they came up with was it wasn't physical infrastructure. You couldn't build a mechanical clock. You had to have a human element to it. And I think I really agree with Charlotte that so much of the sort of machismo type language and the project management language and the top-down language of civil defence and national planning and infrastructure planning and so on often misses out on the things that'll probably get us there in the longer term.
Just to touch more on your day-to-day, Mark, do you think that the current CDM sort of approach, SIMS sort of framework, that sort of thing, and response planning would, enable effective response to an event of such enormous scale?
I don't know I can answer that directly, Ben, but what I can say is I know that NEMA, so the National Emergency Management Agency, is really focused at the moment on a piece of work that'd be relevant to folks who've come along today, called CAT Plan, so catastrophic planning. It's been around for a little while, but the new director, John Price, has said a couple of times in fairly public context, I think it's okay to pass on, that he's really keen to exercise this to, in other contexts, war game it, if you will, not only up to, but beyond the point of system failure. So a lot of exercises that are done in civil defence emergency management won't go past a point of failure. There'll be certain failure nodes along the way, and we learn from those. But John's really interested to see what happens if you push the exercise beyond the point of failure, and what do you learn from that, which is quite an interesting and new departure for the field. And I'll be interested to see how it holds up. I think in some ways it comes back to things that Lucy and Hamish have touched on, though, which is to say, if you do really have a shift, so what Matt was alluding to around, we often think about an event, an emergency comes along, we put the response systems in place, and then we're able to go to recovery back to something quasi-normal. What would happen if you did have a catastrophic event where that wasn't necessarily possible? What does that look like on the ground? And I'm not really sure that the current architecture plans for that. There'd probably be a level that's a shift to a hyper-localization. That takes us in some ways into existing territory. So we have a lot of community response groups for civil defence. It's almost like the neighbourhood watch for emergency management. But I suspect in the kind of event that this project's looking at, you'd see a different kind of architecture, and it would be emergent. It potentially wouldn't be top down and something it wouldn't be planned for.
I think that's a really interesting point, in the sense that, what we saw with COVID was this very much a sort of centralized response from, NEMA, DPMC and that sort of thing. I guess, Lucy, you were part of that, but what happens is one of the kind of key, impacts that we're sort of saying could occur is this malfunction in our communications and data systems in which we rely really heavily. So maybe Ben, Lucy, you could sort of have a reflection on that. And Ben, a number of the kind of things that we've raised in the report have been sort of government interventions. And I wonder, from the perspective of an expert in technology, what are the obstacles here, or opportunities, I suppose?
Where to start? So I sort of reflect on Mark's piece about 100 years. So I'm working in AI all day, every day at the moment, and I can't see 100 days into the future. And so, one of the existential risks that is on your map there is super intelligent AI, right? So, the spectrum of things that we need to consider, given that technology is accelerating so fast, is completely vast. Focusing, on the here and now. I just brought this map up. I haven't got screen sharing, but I've got a map on my other screen here of the submarine cables coming into the country, and there are basically 6 going out across the Pacific and over to Australia, across the Tasman. And just this week in Estonia, an undersea submarine cable's been sabotaged. And there's suspicions pointing to the usual suspects. But we're especially vulnerable to this, and so an external actor could really cut this country off real quick. And we saw in Cyclone Gabrielle in Hawke's Bay that people could not pay in the supermarket when their internet was down. Right, the entire towns the internet was down. They couldn't pay for anything. If they didn't have cash, ATMs didn't work, nothing worked, and they had to actually helicopter in some Starlink things. And so, suddenly the entire Starlink becomes core infrastructure paid for with someone's credit card 2 days before, right? So there's all the digital infrastructure which sustains our mostly urban population of 5 million people is core infrastructure, and we have not tested whether it will work disconnected from the rest of the world. Most of us are using email systems, cloud data systems over in Australia or the US. They would go, and so I think I've really echo the recommendations and findings in your report there, that a national service continuity, digital continuity plan is well overdue, and we really need to, almost like a central nervous system, just need to be able to pull back in and operate core systems of payment systems, messaging systems, and maybe sort of web systems as well. Just in the event that we do get cut off. Next layer above that is that then we're now complete. We've just hollowed out any technology capability in this country that we did have, and completely dependent upon tech giants, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google in particular, and Apple, for core infrastructures. And much of the government runs on Microsoft and Amazon cloud data centers, and so they are a part of our core infrastructure as well. And I'm not quite sure how much of that's legislated, but there's a dependency there that probably needs to be looked at. Is it wise to basically operate your entire country on a private company for the benefit of the shareholders on the US markets, right? So it's an existential question, really. And if not, what are the alternatives? Are we going to buy from China, or are we going to maybe get together with a lot of other countries that have got the same challenges? And maybe my personal view is there should be a percentage of public procurement, IT procurement, which is mandated to be open source, and that's from hardware right up, so chips right up through to computers, right up to software and AI. And at that point, you do have the ability to at least to right to repair for your own IT. So I'll leave it there. But I think the vulnerability of the entire country to digital, either cyber attack or just an outage, maybe even a solar flare, is just it's unmanaged at the moment.
I guess
and Ben, I agree with you there. Because we're relying on two forms of communication, right? So what you've talked about, because I was actually at a presentation recently that also had that picture with the cables of what's coming out from New Zealand and around the world. And globally, there's 500 cables that connect every country, right? There's 6 from New Zealand, but globally it's 500. And then, so you've got the sea and you've got the satellites. And the satellites as well are very vulnerable at the moment. There was actually just a company launched this year, Space Force, that's looking at actually the physical protection of those satellites, because they're starting to get hacked. All of that cybersecurity becomes really critical when you're looking at digital. And digital space, we're consuming more data now than ever before. It's at our fingertips. How many people use Google Maps just to get down to the corner shop or something like that now, even just to find out how long it takes?
Yeah.
So I don't have an answer for it, but I think you're right that we need a strategy or something that even just says this is what we're relying on. These are the things that are critical to us. This is how we need to protect that, whether it's a relationship protection thing, because for some of that, it's not going to make sense for us to create our own Google here in New Zealand. But for open source data and how people use that data, that's a different story.
And open source software as well, and even open source hardware. So Raspberry Pis and upwards. It's pretty base level compute. You're never going to get a GPT-4 trained on it, but it would be able to run core services. And so I just think there's a sort of nervous system metaphor of being able to if you basically need to pull back to your core nervous system, what is that?
Maybe walkie-talkies?
No, so I've just been reading here. I've been listening as well, but I've been reading all of the good comments here on the Q&A from people. Most of it is sort of agreeing or disagreeing with what you good people are saying. which is good.
What's the third option?
Well, there are some questions in here which I'm trying to extract from, but it's a lot of political here, people wondering about the political, how do we approach what Charlotte was talking about, a little bit. How do we actually communicate with policymakers and politics, and public in a way that is useful, because it's right, and it's mentioned a few times in the question there or statements that people tend to go in a little bit harsh, because you could become an evangelist, or you become like, this is all what my life is about, and I need to tell everybody, the world, the Chicken Little, the world, sky is falling and all of that. But because those are the people that are working on it, maybe, but it's now we have so many things coming at us that we need to somehow normalize it, but actually do something at the same time. So I don't know if anybody has further comment on that. How can we talk about these difficult things with the politicians and the public in sort of useful way?
I do have a view there. I think it's not like us starting from scratch. We can actually show examples of what other countries are doing, and NZCat knows that as well, right? I mean, they're working with those other countries and what strategies they have, and can we take parts of that to then build our own strategy? So I don't think that at least in the agencies and our politicians are not against this. It's like, what's the best way to get this information without starting from scratch?
So just to jump in there, in the report, we definitely talk about two particular examples that I would consider really entry-level examples of how to get this stuff off the ground. One is the UK's updated 2023 publicly facing national risk register, which has 89 risks or something like that. That includes things like nuclear miscalculation, massive volcanic eruption somewhere else in the world, and extreme pandemics with 25% fatality, this sort of thing. So they've at least included it in a publicly facing document saying, hey, we're aware of this, let's start thinking about this. Even that doesn't really exist in New Zealand. The risk register is classified, and so that's like step one. And then step two is to make sure that the risks that potentially contain the majority of the harm, these global catastrophes and things like this, make their way into it. And so the US has slipped through by stealth, to use the word that was tossed around before, a Global Catastrophic Risk Management Act in a huge defence spending bill that they had in December 2022, which mandates a systematic assessment of the set of risks known as global catastrophic risks by the chairs or representatives of something like 14 or 16 federal agencies. And so it doesn't say they have to do anything about it, but they have to add an appendix to their interagency plans that describes how basic needs might be met under such circumstances. So it's only funded to the tune of $10 million a year or something like that. But at least they've said, look, by law, you have to analyze these risks and report what they are.
Charlotte, you have a hand up.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk from the other end of the scale, I guess, from the community side. And I think a lot of it is about how you frame the discussions. And as I said, some people don't respond very well to these things, and some people don't believe it. And there's an increasing level of distrust with information being provided by government or by academics or whoever. So I think it's about changing the conversation to a values-based conversation and thinking, well, what's the vision that you want to have for your community? And then, okay, well, what are the sort of strategies we could implement to make sure that we're ready for different things? And you don't necessarily have to say what the things are. And it becomes this agree on decisions rather than assumptions. And so you try and get rid of that, oh, we don't believe in your model, or this variable wasn't the number that we thought it should be. It's kind of if some people have come across the decision making under deep uncertainty area of research that's emerged over the last decade or so, and it's just really just flipping it so that it's a constructive conversation rather than destructive around the inputs to that.
I think that's a really nice point. Mark, your hand's up. I think you're on mute, man. Sorry.
There's always one in a crowd, isn't there? Just to follow on from what Charlotte said and come back to Sam's question, my sense is that the ways of having those conversations with community and government are probably quite different. If we're talking about with community, I think we run a risk of centralizing the culture of expert knowledge. So when I'm working with communities, I like working with a model that posits an axis of centered versus decentered as an orientation. This is for an orientation for ethical practice, and influential versus non-influential. And that is to say, how can we be decentered in this work? It's not about our ideas. It's not about our voice. It's not about saying, why aren't you thinking about X? But we can ask questions that are still influential. Doesn't mean that people get to a certain particular endpoint that we want them to, but it's about that we take responsibility for how we ask the questions, and that we, invite people into ways of thinking that they might not otherwise have thought. So that's just a little bit to add there. But in talking with governments, for me, it comes back a little bit to Charlotte's earlier question about what happened to that report from 35 years ago. And I think when we look back to those times, it was actually quite a series of related but separate ideas that had the potential to really change the conversations globally about resilience. So you had work around nukes, you had conversations about appropriate versus alternate technology, you had conversations about mixed polycultural agricultural production, you had conversations about limits to growth, resource depletion, population growth, and so on. And so much of all of those fields has sort of fallen away. And that wasn't just by accident, or it wasn't because they were boring topics. There was a really marked campaign to move away from having those kinds of conversations. And I think partly that's because many of those issues point to a politic of the local, and there's certain aspects for thinking through how you solve problems, which is quite central, which is challenged by a politic of the local.
What would be your thoughts on that? Passing over to Hamish, have you got any sort of thoughts on that?
I see Ben's got a hand up as well.
Oh no, carry on with Hamish. I was going to say something different.
Oh, okay. So it's really interesting. Like, I sort of sit back and think about it from an institutional standpoint for what we miss in New Zealand. And I'll go back to my 20 years in the US, right? In the US, we had land-grant universities, which were funded centrally, not through education and teaching people, but funded to be the unbiased facilitator, to be able to have these conversations in local communities. And they have an extension system which looks after public health, community development, economic development, agriculture, energy, and it's layered all the way up. And so that extension system is unbiased and it's facilitated, and so it's not held in these tight little pockets with NGOs, etc. But it's engaged and has deep longevity in thinking and access to thought leaders. But its role is to be this unbiased facilitator, to have these conversations at multiple levels. And we miss, from an institutional standpoint, there's nothing in New Zealand which provides that longevity in it. If you go and work in government, you flick through, you're in one role and then you leave and you go somewhere else. You watch it into most organizations. If you're in a business, you roll through those. But in the extension, when it's linked into the university system, you have these individuals who are very passionate, either at a local community level or at a regional level, or they're dealing with national issues or international issues. And that becomes this really unbiased facilitator for dealing with and engaging with these issues in this centralized versus decentralized type space that was just being talked about. And we don't have that here. We have all the different parts, but that's what's the glue, right? Which allows us to be able to have this conversation freely and unbiasedly, and make sure that all the different voices are heard. We end up getting these polarized debates about it, which actually causes us real challenges. And we haven't got this safe space where we create a safe haven. And this person's there within your community who you trust, but also has access to the other ones. And they're living in this open, collaborative space, and their job is to facilitate all of this. And I really think in New Zealand, that's the one thing we're missing. In agriculture, we're trying to sort of bring it back in with on-farm support, but it's not what it is in the US sense of this land grant university that everyone trusts. If you go to like Nebraska, the most trusted organization in Nebraska is Nebraska Extension. It's not the University of Nebraska, it's Nebraska Extension. And they work with everyone from children, from babies and mothers, newborn mothers, giving them nutrition, all the way up to public health with elderly people, as well as agriculture, disaster relief. It's all connected together. And I just, somewhere as I listen to this, I think we're missing that type of an institution to be able to facilitate a whole lot of these issues that are coming forth, and having an unbiased, benevolent dictator above it who's connected to government, but their job isn't determined by the changing government. So that institutional knowledge carries on, and you have that long-term strategy which goes beyond the short-termism of our government at any point in time. And that's the win that America has that we don't have in New Zealand.
Thanks, Hamish. I'm just trying to get Kenneth to let him speak, but I can't seem to give permission. Sorry, Kenneth.
We seem to be technology challenged, Kenneth. You just have to ask the questions in the Q&A. And I just want to let you know, guys, there's quite a lot of good comments, and me and Ben Payne here are new in this, and it's quite hard to navigate, to listen and ask and whatever. So all questions will be answered. You know, we will put it in the end notes, in the show notes, if you like, afterwards. We will go through all of the questions, and hopefully you can all see them as well and read through them. But Ben, Reed, you have your hand up still.
Yeah, I think, you know, when we talk about catastrophic risk, just a few conversations I've had, and I think I've had with you, Matt and Ben and Sam and the team, is around climate migration. And the scenario in, you know, a small number of years or decades that, you know, the Himalayas, basically the area around the Himalayas, are basically unable to sustain the 2 billion people that live there, and there's a need to basically relocate, you know, vast amounts of people really quickly, voluntarily or from a forced nature. And if I was, you know, the government of a country there, you know, with a large military and large navy, and I was looking around the world for somewhere I needed to put 100 million people, then I would start at Southland and work my way north, right? And this is a conversation, you know, that just geopolitically never sees the light of day here. But, you know, what if, you know, how did, you've done the food resilience calculations based on a population of 5 million. What does it look like with 50?
Yeah, I just jump in on that because I think that's an important point in a lot of different ways. One thing I didn't mention in the talk was that, you know, it's all very well feeding New Zealand, but obviously New Zealand exports a lot of food. So if we're only feeding New Zealand, there's a bunch of other people elsewhere that are going without. And so, you know, maximizing that agricultural production, you know, as close as possible to normal, from the point of view of people living elsewhere, you know, is also a good thing to do. And, you know, and it may be that nuclear winter doesn't have the you know, the worst case impact, you know, that 60% yield reduction I was talking about. Maybe it's only 5%, you know, if there's not so many bombs detonated and so forth. But then you've still got a lot of obstacles to sustaining that business as usual. And Australia too, you know, they obviously export masses of food as well. And so between New Zealand and Australia, solving that problem of how to sustain, you know, normal food production even under these sort of circumstances, I think is super important, not just because of the 5 million people that live here.
Can I make one point on that, because it's on this as well, Ben, that and it's about definition, that another thing we never discuss, and we haven't really addressed either in this report, you know, is what are we saving? You know, and when we get to catastrophe, you know, what are we going to save? And I mean, that's the really hard discussion to have. But that comes to your point, like, are we trying to save New Zealanders and New Zealand, or are we trying to save humankind, or are we trying to feed New Zealand or feed, you know what I mean? So it's a big question, right?
It's a semantic question, and I mean, I think there needs to be a time lens on that. Is, you know, how do we weight the needs and the well-being of someone that's not born yet against the weight that is of someone that's sort of 95 years old but still able to vote today? I think, you know, the time waiting of our democracy needs to be looked at. But yeah.
If I can direct people to, at least on some of those points, we touch on those in that paper on New Zealand needs a values framework for how to approach existential risk, which we wrote about 5 years ago, actually. But it talks about things like citizen assemblies and so forth to discuss exactly these sorts of issues.
Very good, guys. I realize we sort of was approaching this with a soft end, so I just thought I'd sort of rapid fire through the questions we've got from the audience. There's one in particular that sort of comes up around sort of biofuel, maybe to bounce off to Lucy and also to Hamish around, you know, what could replace biofuels for food production. You know, one of the solutions in the US was to focus on detritus of food and other crops. And there was also, John Mitchell said that the work was done in the 1970s on gasification of extensive and mature pine and other plant species for alternative fuel source. You know, is this a potential option? That sort of thing. We might have some kind of discourse around that briefly.
Yeah, so for the biofuels, well, I wasn't ruling it out completely, but I think, yeah, it's not like canola was, yeah, like you guys said, it was just an example, but it's, yeah, pine, right? The offshoots from pine, that could work. Yeah, there's other parts that we use and, you know, plant material that we have that can fit really well into biofuels. But again, it comes back to being diversified. So not going fully into biofuels, but then using that with electric and with, fossil fuels, as long as we still have that. Yeah, and with the closure of Marsden Point, they did put a 28-day leeway into, you know, having that, what do you call it, the, it's slipping off my mind, a minimum stock, right? Yeah. 28 days in the country after the closure of Marsden Point. Now, that's not enough when we have a global catastrophe, but yeah, there will be some fossil fuels because it's, yeah, it comes back to having a diversified strategy with energy use. Yeah, not going to one thing. So not all biofuels, not all electric. It's having diversification.
I think touching on the alternatives as well, there's been quite a bit of research done by Scion around that kind of thing. And it seems to be quite, you know, really easy to sort of produce biogas, but more challenging to actually, you know, produce diesel alternatives. So yeah, there's sort of a lot of innovation in tech that needs to sort of go into that. Anybody else have a comment on that at all? I have another response here that New Zealand has ODESC, a hazard risk board, and NEMA has examples of structures that could be expanded to conceptualize, assess, and prepare for major risks. But how is this incentivized and actualized? You've mentioned constitutional change. What sort of constitutional change? So I guess this question is asking, you know, a little bit more for specifics, which is really quite challenging, I guess. But yeah, somebody might want to have a stab in the dark at that one.
I mean, just to Matt's point, I think the citizen assemblies process is a really easy step to move forward. And you know, there's a lot of there's growing evidence that they actually deliver, you know, outcomes and possibly better outcomes than representative democracy. But you know, with that, I'm fascinated by the work that Audrey Tang has done in Taiwan. So she's the digital minister there and has been, you know, working with citizen assemblies, but also with this you know, system called Polis, which, you know, is a almost like a gamified digital collaborative system, which optimizes for consensus over division. And so they've been able to bring, you know, quite divided communities together on issues where they're quite divided and work towards consensus. And so yeah, I think that's definitely, you know, the fact that we've got an adversarial Westminster Parliament, you know, it probably means that some of these issues just never get through. No politician's ever going to win an election, you know, by campaigning on these issues. And look, I think there needs to be a function that's possibly got a 10-year or a longer time frame, and it's an equivalent of a Senate or a House of Lords that's that is basically just mandated to own certain issues that are beyond that 3 year electoral cycle. So,
is there a role for a think tank? as has sort of come through in the research, you know, a non-partisan sort of think tank or something around these sort of major risks or other environmental issues, that sort of thing?
I'm happy. If someone else can answer that, yep.
Mark's got his hand up, but yeah, you can have a wee chat with that, Ben, if you'd like to. Mark, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to take up your question about ODESC and NEMA and constitutional change. Seeing as I work for government, I can't really comment on constitutional change, but I work, you know, within civil defence, which then becomes under NEMA and under ODESC. And one thing I'd point out is that governments, so this is all territorial authorities, so district and regional councils, are actually obliged by law under the Act to respond to emergency management. But that covers not just response, which is what we often think about, it covers recovery. And the legal definition of recovery actually includes resilience. So hold that thought for a second. The second part is that the Director's Guideline for Recovery actually says that community is at the heart of recovery, that we need to do community consultation. So add those together, every time we have an event where we do a formal recovery, technically under law, all local government of Aotearoa is obliged to consult with communities, including some of their ideas about future resilience. So in theory, the architecture for that, indeed the requirement for that is already there. One of the tricks then becomes, how do you do that? And what happens when you do it? Speaking from experience, I'd say, you know, the regional recovery plan we did for Northland coming out of Cyclone Gabrielle, we heard from more than 300 community members. We worked with around about 500 or so stakeholders overall. Some of the best ideas that we had come out for recovery projects and into future resilience projects, they came from community. You know, they didn't come from me, they didn't come from politicians, they didn't come from all the standard things that we're doing recovery. It was incredibly creative ideas that were suggested by community. We've now taken them off the recovery plan, sought funding for them, and then they're happening now already. So the structures are there. It's just whether they're used or not, and whether people follow them or not. Not saying they're perfect, but there's the ability to use them.
I agree with you, Mark. I think there's so many great ideas out there, and you know, we've encountered some of them through this year. You know, engaging with various stakeholders and experts, and you know, but. And you know, we say that some people find this sort of stuff difficult to engage on, but you know, conversely, there's people that are very engaged on these sorts of issues and you know, and want to contribute. And yet again, I go back to the, you know, the classified national risk register, you know, and at least you sort of put out there publicly, these are the problems we face. Tell us your solutions. Then you know, then we might not get the results we're looking for.
On that note. There's so much material here to sort of digest, and it's a huge.
Can I just say that whoever's pointed us towards Mackwell's steam engines, I've never seen that before. It looks awesome. So thank you for that.
Very good. And just sort of a touch on it, I felt this was a really interesting point to sort of raise, and just to conclude on that, we're already sitting at about a 90% probability of one of the Alpine Fault earthquake, Hikurangi earthquake, and tsunami, or a Taranaki volcanic eruption in the next 50 years. We already face an expanding suite of catastrophic risks, which is why it is currently the focus of NEMA. And I guess the point here is that any solutions really need to benefit multi-risks to New Zealand. So there is an understanding of needing to examine and, you know, really confront the suite of risks that we confront as a nation. So on that note, I guess we sort of draw the kind of webinar to a close. We could keep nattering away, engaging with this for several hours. It's certainly Matt, Sam, and my bread and butter for the last year. So yeah, certainly plenty to discuss.
Yeah, reach out and talk to us offline if you want to talk about this. You know, endless conversations to have.
Absolutely. And
can I just reiterate, just fantastic work. The amount you've achieved in a year with this has really brought the whole country forward and up. So just congratulations. Yeah,
I'd agree. Well done, guys.
Thanks very much, team. Really appreciate it.
Well, keep an eye out for the recording, which we'll put up on the website probably next week sometime. And the final main report of at least this phase of the work will be out in about a month's time, and we'll advertise it appropriately at the time.
Mark, are you going to close us off with something nice, or?
Sure, happy to. Whakamoa te kōrero, whakamoa te wānanga, whakamoa ki ranginui e tuiho nei, whakamoa ki a papatu nuku e takoto ake nei, whakatina ki te tumu o te maramatanga, kia tina, huie tai kie. Ka kite koutou.
Ka kite, everyone. Thanks for tuning in the audience. It's been fantastic.
Thanks all.
Thanks
All
very
right.
much.
Yeah.
Sleep well after that.
Bye-bye.
Bye.